Hello! Today we're going to be talking about the skull bones, specifically the bones of the cranium and the facial bones. I hope you admire my mask. If you were already here, you would see me wearing this, and then you would know a lot of them. I'm going to take it off now just in case if you can't hear me very well. Now we'll go here. And these diagrams are on Canvas. I want to recommend that you print them off, and that way you'll be able to kind of like follow it along and label with me as I go through it. So here we go. So today we're talking about the skull, and the skull is made of the cranial bones and the facial bones. The cranial bones are like the top of the head, so they're probably the ones that you've already heard of up here, like frontal or parietal. And then the facial bones make up our face. Well, let's think about functions. Functions of the cranium would be protect the brain. And also, we have some muscles that attach on the top of our head. And functions of the face, really important. Lots of kind of bulges, like little parts that stick out where muscles are going to attach to. What if your eye didn't have a hole in it? Or like what if your mouth didn't have a hole in it? The facial bones have holes in them that allow us to take food and air into our system. Oh, also, like you can see on my facial expressions because muscles attach to the facial bones. So, lots of important things. As we go through this, I use two different colors to distinguish between cranial bones and facial bones. So I encourage you to use two different colors as well. Starting off with the cranial bones, the frontal bone is your forehead, so really easy to be able to touch and feel. Notice that there's this little hole there. It's called a foramen. That is a hole where arteries and nerves are able to pass through. And also, do you get sinus headaches in here? The sinuses are air pockets, and we have them in different bones, and the frontal bones contain sinuses as well, like right here and right here. The purpose of having like a hollow area in our bones is to make our skull lighter, but kind of the trade-off of that is that it's an air pocket that can fill with mucus and then cause sinus headaches. Not very fun. The parietal bone is on the sides of your head, and I labeled it twice because there's two of them. So this light purple is the frontal, and then these kind of like bluish colors right here are the left and right parietal bones. So making up the side of our head. The sphenoid bone. Okay, this is actually my favorite bone. And let me show you a picture on here first because this one is just easier to see. So the sphenoid bone is this green bone inside of there. And if you notice, it has kind of like a bat shape. Or like if we look right here, that would be the body of the bat and that's going to be its wings. The sphenoid bone is considered the keystone bone of the skull because almost all of the other bones are going to connect to it. We can also see it like on the front of our head if you look carefully. It makes up the back of the eye orbit or the back of the socket. So it's that pink color right there. And we can also see it a little bit on the sides. So on our model, see that dark green, the sphenoid bone. And then on the side right there, a little bit more sphenoid bone. The sphenoid also has a sinus. So it also has air pockets just like the frontal bone. The temporal bone. This is underneath, so inferior to the parietal. Temporal bone is like this gold color on here. And a couple of things worth noting is that it has lots of projections. You can actually see them really well in here. Like that's a thing that sticks out, that's a thing that sticks out. I wonder why the bone has parts that are sticking out of it. Well, those are places where muscles are going to attach to it. And also, like right there where my finger is, there's a hole. I wonder why there's a hole going through my temporal bone. What could that be right here? My external acoustic meatus, aka the ear canal. So the temporal bone is important because it houses our inner ear. Also, it's worth noting this projection right here, the mastoid process, you can actually feel that back here behind your ear. And I want you to think about how close this is to your nose and your throat. So it's really easy for this mastoid process to get infected. Notice how the mastoid process is also very close to the brain. So when this gets infected, it's really easy for infections to be able to travel to the brain, and that's no good. The ethmoid bone. So this one makes up kind of like the back of our nose. You can't feel it because there's other bones in the way. But if you look at this image, it's that like purple bone that's deep inside of there. And notice we can see it in two places. So on this one, oh, sorry that I called that purple. That's yellow. The ethmoid bone is yellow. And then you can see a little bit of yellow in the eye orbit. And on our big picture here, the ethmoid bone is orange and orange. So the ethmoid bone forms like the back of the nose and part of the eye orbit. And just like the frontal and the sphenoid, it also has a sinus. This is a nice picture right here where you can see what it looks like all together. But then like from the front view, we can't see all of it. Okay, we've covered all of the cranial bones except for the occipital bone. You can't see the occipital bone from this view because it's the back of the head, so we're going to label it from a different picture. And now we're going to go ahead and do the facial bones. So, facial bones, your nasal bone, this is the bridge of your nose. Like I can easily palpate it right here, my nasal bone. It's paired. That's why I labeled it twice. You have a right one and you have a left one. The lacrimal gland. This you can also palpate. It's like right here. So I'm touching my lacrimal bone right here. And you might also know that that's where your tear ducts are. So lacrimal means tear. And it's a little teeny bone that has a groove in it where our tear ducts are. On here, it's pink lacrimal bone. The zygomatic. This is your cheekbone, like where you put your highlighter. Think about this is a really prominent bone. Like I have chubby cheeks, can't really see mine. And a lot of people like you can see the cheekbone. We have big muscles that attach to it. The zygomatic is dark blue on here. Notice that it also helps form some of the eye orbit. The vomer. This is another nose bone and it's easy to palpate. So if you stick your finger right here, you're touching the front of the vomer. It goes back quite a bit farther, but there it is. Kind of that like purpley color right there. It's not paired, only one of them. The maxilla. This is your upper jawbone and it makes up like the huge central portion of your face. So when I look at it, I notice a few things. I see that there's a suture right here, which means this is another paired bone where we have a right and a left bone. I also see that hole, that foramen. What's the hole for? It must be a spot where arteries and nerves are able to go through. And also just notice like it anchors all the teeth, it forms the nose, it forms part of the eye socket. It's a really important bone. It's big, that's why it has a sinus, the maxillary sinus on both sides right here, a hollow spot that helps the bones be lighter. The mandible is your lower jawbone. The mandible is famous because it's the only bone of the skull that's actually freely movable. So all of these are like tight joints, like you don't want your skull joints to move at all, except the mandible has to be able to move so that we can talk and eat. Because it moves, it's also the strongest bone in the face. Another nose bone, inferior nasal concha. This is like if you stuck your finger up your nose and like you felt the bone that's up inside there, that would be your inferior nasal concha. So we can see it, it's like next to the maxilla there. It's paired, that's why there's two of them. And on here, it's kind of like that light blue color up there in the side of the nose. Okay, we've covered all of the facial bones except the palatine bone because we can't see it. So if you've labeled all the bones, then you have them all except the occipital and the palatine. Here's another image, and this is one since it's the back of the head where we can finally see the occipital bone. So that is our eighth and final cranial bone. It makes up the back of the head. Notice that it has these impressions here. It articulates with the spinal cord, so it has a hole where our spinal cord actually goes through it. And then pause the video and go ahead and label the other sections you can see. Hopefully we identified the parietal bone and the temporal bone from this view. Pause the video and label this. You should be able to label all the pieces. I like to look at this view of the temporal bone because it's easier for us to see this hole right here. That's the external acoustic meatus, that's the ear canal. Here's the mastoid process that I was talking about earlier. This is like a mucus sac, and it's really close to the ear and the nose, so it's close to the outside of the body, so it gets infected, but it's also close to the brain, so it can transmit those infections. This is the styloid process, so it's another place where muscles are going to attach here, muscles are going to attach here. What else? There's the sphenoid bone, our keystone bone, shaped like that, like the side of our head. The ethmoid is way back in there, like the inner eye socket, and then the lacrimal, that was the bone where your tear ducts are. And the nasal bone, the bridge of the nose, zygomatic is our cheekbones. Upper jawbone, maxilla, lower jawbone, mandible. I didn't mention this earlier, but put your tongue on the roof of your mouth, and your tongue is touching the maxilla. Let's get a view of that. So the maxilla, the upper jawbone is orange. And then can you see on the bottom in there how like that's where your tongue would touch, like the palate of your mouth. And finally, from this view, we can see a bone that we've never been able to see before. It's called the palatine bone, and it's right there. So we can see that it's next to the maxilla. And on here, it's that pink bone. So this view looks very different than the picture we're seeing on here. It makes up the hard palate of the mouth. That's the roof of the mouth. So like the front roof of your mouth is the maxilla. The back roof of your mouth is the palatine. Palatine, palate. And yeah, if you look in here, kind of has an L shape going on. So again, we're looking for the pink bone that articulates with the maxilla. Now we've labeled every single bone. Then take a minute, pause the video, label everything else we can see on there. Yeah, this is a nice view of the sphenoid. We're seeing half of it. And this is a really nice view of the vomer. Remember, the vomer is like that lower nose bone right here. So just thinking about like how far back that actually does go. And we're seeing like half of the ethmoid bone. Normally the ethmoid bone, it's that yellow one that looks like lines to us. So that's kind of interesting that we can see more of it there. And you can also see the spongy bone inside of all of this flat bone. Okay, two more things to mention. The hyoid bone is a very special bone because it does not directly articulate with any other bone. That means that it's a bone that doesn't connect to any other bone. You can see it on this skeleton, maybe. Can you see I have my finger on a bone and I'm moving it in there? Hopefully you can kind of see it. You might be wondering, if it doesn't connect to any other bones, what holds it in place? And the answer is your tongue. So your tongue attaches to the hyoid bone, like back in there. And if we think about why, well, the functioning of the tongue, it has to be able to move so that we can speak and we can chew. And so if that hyoid bone was attached to another bone, it would limit the movement of the tongue. So because it's free floating, we have maximum movement. And I mentioned this on the other slides, but there's 4 bones that have sinuses. Sinuses are like pockets of air. Our head is very heavy. It's hard for our body to support the weight of our head. So over time, we have some hollowed out air pockets that make our head lighter, so it's easier to support. We see those in the frontal bone, the ethmoid, the sphenoid, and the maxilla. And why do you get sinus headaches? Because they fill up with mucus and they cause pressure. And that's a wrap. I want to show you a human skull that I have. It's one of my prized possessions. Don't ask me where I got it from because I don't know. It was in my classroom when I came here. But if we orient ourselves, okay, this is the eye orbit. So that means this has to be the frontal bone. And then the sides of the head are the parietal bone. Look at those sutures. Skull joints are called sutures, and do you see how they fit together like puzzle pieces? That's to be able to keep any of the skull bones from moving. And then back here, we have the occipital. And I want to show you the inside too. The inside is really cool looking. Can you see these impressions? Kind of look like a tree or something like that. Like, oh yeah, right. Right in here above my finger. There it is. Those lines, those are blood vessels. So there's actually grooves on the inside of our skull where the blood vessels go through. One more time, I'm going to find all the bones on here for you so that you can actually see them. This is the frontal bone. This is the parietal bone. It's paired, so we have two of them. The back of the head is occipital. So frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, underneath my hair back there. And then from the front, it's really easy for us to see this is the mandible. This orange thing is the maxilla. Let's look in the nose. The dark blue in the nose right there is the vomer. The yellow above it is ethmoid. And the light blue in the sides of the nose right there, inferior nasal concha. The bridge of the nose is the nasal bone. And again, this is the maxilla. It touches the zygomatic, our cheekbone. Let's go through the eye orbit. So made up by the frontal bone and then made up by the zygomatic bone. That green one back in there is our keystone bone. That's actually the sphenoid in the eye. And you see the yellow in there? That's part of the ethmoid. So see the ethmoid in the nose, see the ethmoid in the eye. And that pink one right there is our lacrimal, so where our tear glands are. And then from this view, this is the occipital. That green is the sphenoid. Again, it's everywhere. That's why it's the keystone bone. That blue part that's up in here is actually the vomer. So like that front part of your nose right here is going all the way through back there. That yellow one is the ethmoid, and the pink one is the palatine. That's the one that we have a hard time seeing from any other view than this one. And then inside, we have my favorite view of the sphenoid. Like there you can see it all like a bat. The temporal bone, the occipital bone, the frontal bone. That yellow part is more ethmoid. Why is there a hole in the occipital bone? Because your spinal cord would be right here. And all of those other holes are going to be places where vessels and nerves have to go through. Thanks for listening. Let me know what questions you have.